Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'll go first. Thank you for that presentation, and thanks to the co-chairs for your opening remarks. I appreciated them very much. So for the staff, I guess there's been a lot of questions from the community about this process and about this proposal, and so I'm going to try to ask a few of them here, and I'm sure people will have their own public comment, but I also have a lot of questions. In terms of the city's goal of an overall percentage of affordable housing that we're looking to kind of get to here, what is our current affordable housing percentage of the housing stock right now? For some reason, I have 13 point something % in my mind. And what is the number that we're trying to get to through this and all of the other measures that you had suggested before? Are we trying to get to 50% like Vienna, as some people have been talking about, or are we more in the 16 to 18% goal rate?
I'm going to move it here. Maybe you should just answer the whole thing.
Thank you, through you, Madam Co-Chair. Excellent question, and we are currently just under 15% when we consider all affordable units subject to deed restrictions that I mentioned earlier. That number has come down a little bit, but has been relatively stable. It was 15% in 2000. We've seen it come down as we've seen market rate housing be added, subject to the original inclusionary ratio. The goal that we have talked about through the Envision process, I know we're just finishing the Envision plan, but we do have indicators that we've talked about with the Envision Housing Working Group, and the recommendation there was to create 3,125 affordable units by 2030. And so that, accounting for what we would expect to come from the market, would leave roughly 1,000 units for the city funding to create over that time. And if we were successful in creating that number of affordable units over that time, we would expect to see the ratio of affordable units in the city rise from just under 15% to close to 16%, if I remember correctly. But so it's the units that we're creating are mostly to kind of maintain that level and then to build upon it somewhat.
Okay, thank you for that. And just to follow on to that question, you mentioned funding being limited earlier, and I think that's an interesting or important component of this conversation. I think there's a lot of people that in the community who feel like this proposal would just create a whole lot of units and it would just increase the density in their neighborhoods by an exponential amount. I just want to have you quickly touch upon the fiscal 19 funding was about $13.6 million for affordable housing, and roughly it's around $540,000 to create one unit of affordable housing. I thank you for providing that information today, which is about 25 units. And over the past several years, we've been averaging around 50 to 60 units a year. And even with an additional $20 million that the City Council has asked the manager for another $20 million, that's another just 40 units. So can you explain a little bit about the funding and if I've made any mistakes in my numbers, just to clarify for the audience?
Sure. No, again, happy to provide some more information. So it is expensive to produce housing in the city. We are working in a market where we would love to see the costs be lower. So there's no housing that we're producing with the affordable housing providers that we work with. It does not require a significant amount of subsidy and a very significant amount of local subsidy from the city and from the Affordable Housing Trust. I will say that, again, these developers will go seek funding from other sources, including other public sources at the state, and sometimes other publicly available sources where they're competing with affordable housing developers in Boston, and in Worcester, and in Somerville. So it is intense competition, and oftentimes developers are forced to wait for that funding because it is limited. In some ways, that funding is more limited than the city funding. The challenge that we have had has not been resources, not that resources are not significant, but the most significant challenge that we have had has been identifying sites where we can put that funding to work. And if we are talking about development costs of 500 and, in the mid 500s range, some of that cost is covered by private sources. If there's a mortgage on a rental building, if it's a home ownership project, there'll be sales proceeds. There'll be other subsidy sources that come in, but we're likely talking about in the range of 200,000 or so a unit of subsidy from the city. So when we talk about the funding that we have, that's at this point a good rule of thumb to use. And again, looking back, as you noted, we have used funding, and I'd say over the last 3 years or so, we have seen about 180 or so new affordable units, new development units come into the pipeline. So we're at about 60 units a year, and those are in really 2 or 3 projects that we've mentioned here. The Concord Highlands development that's under construction now on Concord Ave is 98 units. The Frost Terrace project that we're expecting to begin construction this year in Porter Square is 40. And those are the, really the success stories where we've been able to work in the market, identify sites. And so the idea here is to improve upon that, help us look at sites that are now not available. There's another site that we looked at that is a kind of a similar site to the site that we looked at in Porter Square, where an affordable housing developer proposed or was looking at a site and had the idea that even doubling density and making an offer based on that was not successful. They made a very aggressive offer. We thought it was crazy, given what the market was, and it was still not enough. So that's what these guys are facing as we look at more sites that don't pan out than do.
All right, thank you for that. And it's interesting you bring up the Cambridge Highlands project and the Frost Terrace. I was looking at sort of the units that have been built since 2007, and the majority of them are in the Port neighborhood. Some of them were in Cambridgeport, and some of them are right here in Central Square, but the majority, over 60%, are in the Port neighborhood, so it's nice to see some of those moving in different parts of the city. I also wanted to ask, there's been a lot of conversation about what does in perpetuity mean, and I think a lot of people are concerned about this because there's been a lot of talk about the expiring use at Ringe Towers, and that there's a real fear that we will create all these units and then 20 years from now, 30 years from now, they will go to market rate housing, and we haven't done the thing that we've said we want to do. Can you explain the mechanics of what in perpetuity means? How it is? Does it end? How do the mechanics work at the city level? If there's a covenant, or at the state level, what those mechanisms are? Briefly.
I'll do this. I'm looking at the city solicitor who can correct me if I'm wrong. So I will give you kind of the layperson's overview and then defer to the city solicitor if there's any clarification that she'd like to make. But when we're talking about the housing that the city is funding, we are putting in place long-term permanent affordability covenants that are signed by the owner and remain in place based on the funding that the city or the Affordable Housing Trust is putting into a development. Not uncommon for the projects that we're talking about, the example of Concord Highlands or the one in Porter Square, to have multiple affordable housing restrictions held by different public agencies. There are, maybe private entities that also restrict them, given some of the tax credits that come in. So that's one class of restriction, and we're putting that in place because we're a lender to the project. So we are funding the project. We are working with the other funders, putting our restrictions in place. That gets us restrictions that are designed to be permanent, so they'll be in place. What we're looking at here, where we're talking about zoning, I think would be even a little bit better in terms of the restrictions that we would have, because we would, of course, continue to have the restrictions that come from the funding that we would be putting in place, but we would also look at the zoning requirements, which would also require that all units be affordable and remain affordable. And so we would likely look at this more like we look at restrictions in the inclusionary program, which are zoning based, and notwithstanding what's happening with other funding, the zoning is the zoning, and if there's ever an issue, there's a zoning violation that's enforceable by the city, in addition to the contract that's in place, that the covenant that's on record. So in some ways, we would be able to get a kind of a better restriction from coming at it from both the zoning perspective and the financing perspective.
Okay, and then my last question, I think, has to do with the planning board and how much community engagement there would be around the urban forum. I know that there's been a lot of concern, I share them, around how much process there will be able to be, how much say the planning board would have to say. So I just wrote down what you said. So the planning board would have a process with community engagement and a public session, and at the end of that process, no special permit would be given, but a report would be given to staff and the Affordable Housing Trust on any design changes made on that feedback, ostensibly from both the planning board and the public comment that they had heard, particularly if there were abutters, et cetera. Am I understanding that correctly? And if maybe you can just explain the process, because I don't think I quite understood it, and maybe everybody else understood it perfectly, but if you can explain it.
Through you, Madam Chair, the planning board does design review typically of special permit projects, and they also look at affordable housing projects that are actually going to the Board of Zoning Appeals for comp permit, but they do a design review of those as well. And they are reviewing the projects. First of all, they have a public hearing where they hear testimony, so there's an opportunity for abutters, neighbors to present and express their concerns, which feeds into then the board's evaluation and their final comments on a project. They then express what they would like to see changed. In a special permit project, they are the final decision makers for that discretionary permit, but they often then say, here's what we want to see, and now CDD, urban design staff, go on and have continuing design review. A lot of iterative conversations then happen between staff and developers to keep refining the project based on what the planning board has expressed. In instances where they are making comments that are going to another board like the BZA, they put together a report. They often still suggest that staff continue to have those discussions because we are essentially the agency in the city that has design staff to support that design development. But the final decision rests with the BZA, for instance, in 40B projects. In this instance, what we envision is that there will be the same kind of public process where the community will have an opportunity to provide their input. There will be public comment. The board will hear that, and based on their evaluation as well as what they hear from the public, they will put together a series of recommendations which they will forward to both the Affordable Housing Trust and to staff the way that they typically do for continuing design discussions and refinements. So staff will continue to work with the developers. The concern that we have heard sometimes is that where is the leverage, because there is not a discretionary permit which might get denied. But as Chris mentioned, the majority, well, not even the majority, all of the projects that go through that are 100% affordable require funding from the trust. And so the trust has an important role here. And I think the trust members will probably speak for themselves as we go along, but they have an interest in good design outcomes to ensure that, first of all, the projects that are being built are great places for people to live who are going to be there, but also to ensure that there is a good fit with the rest of the community, so we're not creating a terrible backlash against affordable housing. And this is the trust's mission, is to make sure that they are able to have additional affordable housing and continue that development. So they have an interest in making sure that the design outcomes are positive. So with those two entities then would be responsible for taking the planning board comments and continuing to work with the developers to refine this. We do this now on every single affordable housing project, and we'll continue to do that in under this overlay scenario.
Thank you.
So the difference would be that the discretionary process can be appealed legally and the design process cannot, but it's pretty much the same process up to that point. Okay. I just want to say that I think one thing that's missing from this conversation is this idea of middle income, the idea up to 120% AMI. I'm going to yield the floor at this point, but I think it's a part of the conversation that we really need to be having as we're discussing this. So thank you very much.